The title of tonight's event is Being Future Ready in the Noisy Now. Let's find out what's going on.
Thank you very much. So before we get started, why the cameras? This year we're pushing out a project from Bainbridge Prepares called the Replication Kit. So this is for other communities. There's about a dozen or two versions of us around the country that we've helped to get started. Many of them are asking for help for what's next. Right now, we're a 750 person strong nonprofit. That's not where we started 12 years ago. So we're helping to see folks how they can march into the future. My vision is that if we build on the right kit, what took us 10 years should take them 2 years. So, and of any community to take on the responsibility of building this to give away for free, I think it's Bainbridge Island, because we have a lot of privilege and we have got a volunteer rate that's through the roof. So what we're capturing here is a longer term picture for other towns around the country. When they want to start doing what we have done in their locale, but they need the long-term vision. What are they doing? What do they show to the city manager, to their mayor, to their police chief and fire chief in terms of, hey, here's where we want to go in a decade and in 2 decades and then longer? That's what this video will be about. Only half the time Bob and I will be having a conversation. We expect you all to come in the second half. We'll do that thing where we repeat your question so it gets captured on the microphone, because that will be just as valuable for the audience that will be watching this, other versions of us all around the rest of the country. Okay, so please forgive the extra cameras. All right, Bob.
The present is so noisy. It's so awfully noisy, so dangerously noisy. And yet, if you think future back, if you go 10 years out and think back, you can get a kind of clarity that you can't get in the noisy now. So I'm Bob, and I'm going to be representing that future back voice in the conversation tonight. This is Scott, and Scott will be representing the future readiness, the kind of future now view. How can you be more ready? I am with a group called Institute for the Future that's been doing this longer than anybody. We started in 1968. And we do 10-year forecasts. Sometimes we go 20, sometimes 30. The farthest out we've ever gone is 100. And we've gotten really good at it. So most of the time we're right. We do keep track. So the first question you should always ask a futurist is, have you outlived your forecasts? And we have 5 times plus over. 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures have actually happened. So we're usually right. But it turns out that's not how you evaluate a futurist. That's how you evaluate a fortune teller. The way you evaluate a futurist is, does our foresight provoke your insight that leads to a better decision of the present? So it's not about prediction. Nobody can predict the future. It's about provocation. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So if you take the future back view, if you take that view, what it does is help you develop your clarity about the future. Because what we've learned is the best leaders, the best organizations are very clear about direction in this highly uncertain future, but they're very flexible about execution. And that's one of the things I really like about Scott, is that he's teaching this discipline of resilience that starts from the noisy now, but helps to be prepared even in a world where you can't predict.
So in this conversation, I'll be the voice of the future ready. In other words, what you can do to stop now in the busy now, we're all busy. How do you stop and pause for just a moment to actively think about what system shocks are going to be coming in our lifetime, and what can we do now in a calm, collected manner? And then we'll go back and forth, debating back and forth a few different topic areas. Be thinking of your questions, jot them down on a piece of paper, but we'll get to them pretty quickly. It might be of the 4 topic areas that we cover this evening. It could be about something else. Anything is fair game.
Mm-hmm. So we've drawn out 4 themes that we'd like to talk about that come from Scott's book and from my books. And we'll be talking about those kind of one at a time, and then we'll open the conversation. But we want to begin by talking about the concept of a commons. You know, what does it mean to create a commons? What does it mean to find a kind of shared space, a common space that can help us develop our clarity? And one of the things that I do, that I started doing just the week before 9/11, was teaching at the Army War College. And I'm not a military guy by background, so I never imagined I'd be doing this. But over those years, I've been promoted, and now I get the new 3-star generals on their first week in Washington. And they read these books, and we talk about leadership, and we talk about strategy. And it's their first week in Washington, so I asked them about what they're learning on Capitol Hill and in the White House. And what they learned is our political leaders right now, of both parties, our political leaders are often certain, but rarely clear. And in what the Army War College calls the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, in a VUCA world, certainty gets you in big trouble, because certainty is brittle, and brittle breaks. So to develop a commons, which is what you're doing in Bainbridge Prepares, to develop a commons is to find your clarity. Even though you can't predict the future, and even though it will be a VUCA world, find your clarity and then organize around that clarity so you can develop a sense of hope as you engage with that VUCA world.
That's really what we're attempting to do with building social community and building social resilience at a community-wide scale, not just individuals. Now, yes, this is important work for you to do individually. It's even more important work for us to do collectively as a town, as an island. There are certainties. You know, there's the classic death and taxes. I might add one more certainty. We know there's going to be an earthquake in Seattle. We don't know if it's going to be next week or not in our lifetime. Either way, though, we do know that science tells us that is a certainty. So again, when we go to the differences between having clarity and certainty, there's certain things there's some things that you know are certainties that you shouldn't be a surprise. You shouldn't get to the point of retirement and then have a shock of, oh my gosh, I should have been saving for the last 50 years, right? That's a certainty in that you know that's coming, and small individual decisions that you make daily, weekly, monthly, contributing to an IRA, for an example, that just makes sense. That's normalized. And much of the work that Bainbridge Prepares is doing is normalizing that and doing so in a way that not only makes it feel normal, but it makes it feel achievable as well.
Mm-hmm. And the beginning of that, in a VUCA world, the beginning of that is to link to nature. So we call this skill bioempathy, the ability to empathize, to learn from, to listen to nature, to listen to what's going on around us. And we're facing a very threatening natural world over the next decade. So the author David Corton talks about how nobody wins. Nobody wins on a dead planet. And the author, David Corton, is with us tonight. So just raise your hand. So if those of you who want to talk in more detail about this, David has done a great job of outlining what needs to be done. But the beginning of this is the empathy with nature, the understanding of nature, and the VUCA world of climate disruption is hitting the fan over the next decade. So the next decade will be that kind of tipping point. So what Scott's talking about at an individual level, you know, we all live on an island, for God's sakes, and we all chose to be here. But the Earth is an island too. Mm-hmm. And what you're talking about is how can you have bioempathy in a daily way? Mm-hmm. And one of the things I like about Bainbridge Prepares is you have people outside with nature. You have people figuring out how to get on and off the island at a crisis, how to store food, how to be available in terms of natural resources and growing things on the island. But say a bit about that, about bioempathy on the island and how that links to Bainbridge Prepares.
Well, are you guys familiar with the rule of threes, the backpacker camping wisdom? So there's a rule of threes. as human beings in a dire circumstance, we can survive for up to 3 minutes without air. We can survive up to 3 hours in inclement weather without shelter, and then you really need to get shelter. We can survive for 3 days without water, albeit very uncomfortably, and 3 weeks without food, again, uncomfortably. But we use those rules of 3. That defines a lot of what our teams do their work focused on, both individually. Hey, let's make sure, let's have water as a focus. Do you know where your first 3 days of water are coming from? Post-earthquake, okay? How about your first 3 weeks of food? And then we also look to solve that collectively. Okay, well, if we're without water for a month or 6 weeks, how are we going to work on that collectively as a town? So we use some of those rules that come from the natural world and our interaction with the natural world by spending a lot of time in the Olympics. And we bring that back to the island, because when the earthquake happens, the bridge will become impassable, the ferry will be out of commission temporarily. We truly are an island at that point. It's not actually that much different than being out in the middle of the Olympics. So we have a medical reserve corps team. There's several members of them here tonight. We have part of that is a wilderness first aid class. That is a class to train normal people like you and me how to take care of each other in what's defined as wilderness. Wilderness is defined as being 1 hour or more away from definitive care. In other words, a hospital or a fully functioning clinic. Guess what? Bainbridge Island, after the earthquake, will be defined as wilderness, because we will be way more than an hour away from definitive care. So we don't wring our hands about that. We get a bunch of positive-minded people together and start putting our collaborative hats on to think about how do we solve that.
Say a little bit about the flotilla of captains that you've organized and how you practice, because to me those things are just stunning, and they're so immersive and so engaging about how you do that to be prepared.
Yeah, do we have any of our captains from the flotilla here tonight? Anybody? Can I brag on you? We've got one up front. Okay, so we're an island, right? I think our flotilla is like 75 boats, vessels strong right now. These are vessels both in the water right now on various sides of the island, or out of the water, in dry dock or on somebody's driveway. Either way, it's okay. What we know is that post-earthquake, we are going to need the ability, after the Setch effect, the bathtub effect, settles down in the Puget Sound, we're going to need the ability to go around and deliver people and goods and gear, both on island and off island. Now, Bainbridge Prepares partnership has 3 entities. Our nonprofit, citizen-driven nonprofit, the city, who joined us about 6 years ago, and the fire department, who has joined us since month 1, year 1. What we don't wait for, though, as private citizens, is we do not wait for a government solution. So we don't wait and say, well, post-earthquake, Coast Guard, how are you going to help us get back to the island? Or, hey, that one police boat that we have that's also a part-time fireboat, how are you going to help us get back to the island? No, we don't. We're go-getter citizens, and we live on this very unique island with a bunch of brainiac people. So we figure it out ourselves and make our own flotilla. So it's citizen-driven solutions that will be going around post-earthquake to pick up people and gear from both sides of the water, both from the city, Seattle side, as well as Kitsap County marshalling points.
Mm-hmm. So you teach that through immersive learning. You have a simulation where you simulate the crisis, and then you teach it through immersive learning. Who's good at immersive learning? Who's good at simulation? Kids. Kids. They're really good at simulation. You know how they learn it? Video gaming. Video gaming. So those of us who are parents or grandparents, sometimes we kind of cringe because today's video games are, in my opinion anyway, often too sexual or too violent. But the medium of gaming, the medium of immersive learning, that's what you do when you do the simulation with the flotilla. You're playing an immersive game. And the kids are really good at this. So I'm really optimistic about the kids, and you'll see in the Full Spectrum Thinking book, you'll see a real optimism. I'm very hopeful about the kids. I'm very optimistic if they have hope. If they have hope. If they don't have hope, then these same video gaming medium can be used to encourage depression or even suicide or joining extreme groups. So it's not an easy out, but these kids are learning the medium that we have to learn now to do the next leadership skill I want to talk about, which is smart mob organizing. This is a term that was developed in Silicon Valley by Howard Rheingold, the visionary in Silicon Valley. And Howard talked about how we have to organize as communities, like you're doing. When I was in divinity school, we read Saul Alinsky, the great community organizer in Chicago, the kind of Rules for Radicals book he was called. And it's that skill of organizing communities. But now we have digital media to do that. So we can do smart mobs, which can turn into what we call shape-shifting organizations. So they're not straight hierarchical. Their command and control doesn't work anymore. That was my big surprise in working with the Army. I thought the Army was still command and control. They're not. They're what they call commander's intent, which is basically what I said earlier, be very clear about direction, very flexible about execution. And the organizations they create, and this is especially the special forces, the organizations are shape-shifting. So Scott, you're a smart mob organizer. You're organizing a smart mob, and you're creating a shape-shifting organization.
I read that same Rules for Radicals book. I love that book.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
We unfortunately we haven't found the Saul Alinsky of cyberspace yet.
Yeah. I bet one's coming.
I
bet one's
think
out
so
there.
too.
And they're probably 13 years old.
Right.
So in our world, smart mob communications, that group communications is incredibly important, and we plan for it two ways. And what you were referring to earlier of kids learning through games, we do the same thing. We call them tabletops, which is we just step through a scenario where we can fast forward in time while we're all sitting around calmly at a conference room table in the fire department or in City Hall and plan out, okay, what if this happens, then we do X, Y, and Z. And our team leads, some of them are here tonight, get involved in that so that we can make that real-time decision-making almost in a video game type format,
Yes.
in a simulated format. But communications in general, we think of two buckets of solutions. There's the low-tech solution, and then there's the high-tech solutions. Example of a low-tech solution, again, is related to children, is a family reunification guide. So this is a single-page document. You have a very calm conversation with the people that you live with, 20 minutes over dinner. And all it is it's simply recording who is going to reach out to who is going to go check on who post-earthquake. Because remember, the landlines will be cut, your cell phones will stop working, your textability will stop working in relatively short order. So it behooves you just to have a quick conversation to say, hey, if it happens and kiddo, you are at school, you're going to stay at school and we're going to come get you. Or if you've got an elderly parent that lives with you, you let them know, this is what I want you to do. If the lights go out, the power goes out, this is what I want you to do. All that gets recorded in a very simple conversation and on a simple piece of paper ahead of time. That 20 minutes saves you hours or days of confusion post-earthquake. When there's a lot of other things going on, you all will be able to refer back to, oh, I know the plan. For the 4 people that I live with, this is the plan on who's going to go check on who. So that's a low-tech example. All you need is a piece of pen and paper. High-tech would be a combination of, we'll stay in the communications theme, a combination of our ham radio team and our tech team, which is heavily based now on Starlink. Does anybody here have Starlink at home? The satellite connection device? Nobody yet, okay. This is going to change everything. I have it at home because I am in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the Grand Forest, and we can't get DSL. And I have raised 2 teenagers with borderline dial-up speeds. And that is dangerous to do, folks. What we have now is the ability to go directly to a satellite. And guess what is not affected by an earthquake? Is the satellite connection. So as long as you still have power to your Starlink, you can still connect with that satellite. So a combination of ham radio, which is a terrific way to talk even post-disaster, and we've got an entire team called the Bears that runs that team. And then we've got our tech team that's got Starlink and much more. It's a blended solution of high-tech solution that post-disaster, post-earthquake, will be able to reinforce how all of our teams talk to each other.
So the last thing we want to talk about, and then we're going to open the conversation to you. The last thing we want to talk about is creating and sustaining positive energy. So leaders have to be able to walk into a room and exude positive energy. So Maya Angelou said, "We don't remember what people said to us very well, but we almost always remember how they made us feel." There's a lot of positive energy people on Bainbridge Island. Scott is one of them. From the first time I met him, I always come away from meetings with Scott feeling better than when I went in. He's energizing, and that's the kind of leadership that you actually need. When I did this book and first talked about that skill, I did a presentation to CIOs in Silicon Valley, a room full of CIOs from big companies in the Valley. And one of them said, when I explained this need for positive energy, he said, "Oh, you know about the chi suckers, the chi suckers." He was a Chinese American guy who understood Chinese medicine. He understood the concept of chi, energy. And what he was saying was there's some people who just suck the energy out of a room. Bob Sutton at Stanford said it's easier to show people that you're intelligent by being negative than it is by being positive. So what you'll see in a lot of meetings is that people will try to show their power, show their intelligence by saying something negative. That in a VUCA world is really gnawing in a very dangerous way. So the challenge is, how do you create and sustain positive energy, not a Pollyannish kind of energy, but a positive energy? And here, Scott, I wonder if you can talk about the motivator of kind of love versus fear, and also that need for neighborhood connection, not just for creating stuff to survive.
Yeah, attitude is clearly key. When you end up talking about earthquakes and tsunamis a lot, that's a doomer of a topic. That's just a serious bummer. So there's a few key rules that my crew has created from day one. One is preparedness through parties. We throw a lot of parties, a lot of socials. Our Map Your Neighborhood program, which is the mapping of streets so you get to know your neighbors, the entire thing is based off of parties. But the attitude that you take can make all the difference in the world. So there's a lot of folks who will use fear as a motivator. Now, fear will get people to act. I can scare you with statistics and visuals, and that will get you to go and do a little bit of action tonight, a little bit of action tomorrow, maybe some the next day. It doesn't stick. It's not a long-term action. And if I hit you with that fear message over and over, guess what? It's not much fun. You create a town that's not much fun to live in. We do a judo move. We flip that on its head and go the opposite. We approach community preparedness looking at it through a lens of love rather than fear, community building rather than fear. So it takes longer to get action to happen, but when it does happen, it sticks. And you are creating an environment, whether it's an individual household, a street of neighbors, an entire town, you're creating an environment that's enjoyable to live in. Because again, we know the earthquake will happen, we have no idea when. So we might as well create a Bainbridge Island that is enjoyable to live in, even if the Seattle earthquake doesn't happen for another 50 years. So attitude is particularly key. It's also more important, arguably, than gear. Now, yes, there's a few key pieces of gear post-earthquake you will be very glad that you have in your garage or in your go bag. But what's more important than gear overall is relationships. And it is not relationships through Facebook. Those are relatively useless. It's relationships with the other people in this room. It's relationships with the people that are on your street, because life will get very local very quickly once this disaster happens. So yeah, if you want gear, you can buy gear. As Americans, we are very good at buying stuff. Frankly, I wish we were less good at buying stuff. But as we often will tell folks, don't buy a single piece of gear until you have done your Map Your Neighborhood party. So you've met with your neighbors, because everybody in the neighborhood doesn't need a chainsaw. You just need one on the street, owned by someone who knows how to not cut their own kneecaps off. And then you're good, you're golden. So when people look at gear checklists, when they start to say, oh, I want to get prepared, what do I do? And they look at the checklists that are on our website or anywhere else, you can get overwhelmed. Some of those checklists are daunting.
Yes.
Don't buy anything yet. Have the meeting with your neighborhood first. Get to know your neighbors. What are their skills and what stuff do they have? Then collectively you can make that decision.
Okay, so let's open the conversation. And the last thing I want to share as you're thinking about a question is, at Institute for the Future, we've been doing this since 1968, we've learned to differentiate between a trend, which is a pattern of change you can extrapolate from with confidence, and a disruption, which is a break in the pattern of change. What we're here to talk about tonight is both. There's a trend aspect. In other words, the earthquake is inevitable. That's a trend. But when and how and where and what actually happens, that's a disruption. Mm-hmm. And when we experience it, it's going to be a surprise. It's going to be a surprise. And if we're prepared, if we've practiced, if we've gamed it, we're going to feel a lot more ready. And this is basically what my friends in the Army call wargaming. And I got to visit the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert, which I thought of after I was there. I thought of it as the world's largest video gaming parlor. It's the size of the state of Rhode Island. And it's got real tanks, real helicopters, real actors from whatever country they're preparing people to go to. And in these exercises, which are 2 weeks at a time, 24 hours a day, in these exercises, many people are killed without having to die. Such powerful learning. And that's basically what you're doing in Bainbridge Prepares. It's creating an environment that actually is kind of fun because you're practicing. But when that trend actually does happen and it becomes a disruption, you're going to feel more prepared.
One other thought before we open up to questions. That reminds me, so much of the way we look at natural disasters is as a microcosm of what a lot of social critics call the long emergency.
Yes.
So the long emergency is, what does life look like once we have exhausted fossil fuels, or they've become to the point where they become unaffordable? That's a very different world that we are all used to living in. And if you think about a widespread regional disaster, not one that pops in and out like a tornado, but one like the Cascadia earthquake, the Seattle earthquake, where it will be completely widespread from BC to Portland. It's almost like a microcosm of the long emergency, because all of the normal energy sources will be cut off. All of life as we know it will be cut off. And not just for a few inconvenient days or weeks, but months. And so much of our work is looking at that long emergency and looking at how we operate our island in that kind of a scenario where all of the normal things are cut off. Mm-hmm. It's useful for, I guess it's the equivalent of like a wargaming, just as an entire town.
It is. That
happens to be an island, so it's easily definable in terms of what do we have access to easily versus not.
It is. Great. Well, thank you very much. We do have a microphone, so that's wonderful. You have questions or comments that we can riff off of, please.
For those of you who are my age or older, I told Tyler, who's our program director, and he's here with the microphone, I told him he gets to be Donahue and run up and down the aisle.
Nice.
Tyler's not my age, and the glazed look on his face, he actually had to say, I don't understand the reference. Tyler's going to be our Donahue.
Please.
Question up here.
Right up here, Tyler. Yes, please. Well, he let you hold the microphone, which Phil Donahue never did. But
Hello, I'm Toby.
Hi, Toby.
The more money people have, the less they need their neighbours. What they need is people they can pay to clean their homes and cut their grass. Are parties enough to get those people involved, to connect with their neighbours and prepare for disasters?
Yes and no. No, parties are not enough. That's literally the conversation starter to get into their brain. It is very difficult to get into their brain. We're now going on 12 years with Map Your Neighborhood as the core of everything else that we have built. Our network of disaster hubs, which is, Bloedel Reserve and the Senior Center and the bakery down in Fort Ward. These are the places that will be stocked with gear that our Medical Reserve Corps folks then know how to use. Everything that we have built is on that foundation of Map Your Neighborhood. 12 years we have been hammering on that. We're at 40%, 45%, Tyler, 40. We're not even halfway there yet. Frankly, I've told the team if they hit 80%, we're done. That's victory, because I don't think that we'll ever hit the last 20%. Similar to like the old advertising adage, if you've got to hit somebody with a message 7 times, 7 different ways before it even registers a little bit. So we try lots of different mechanisms to get into that person, that very busy person's attention, but it's difficult. But once we do get the attention and they do go to the party, what they start to see is that there is social proof. Oh, well, if I go to a party and Toby's there, and Toby shows me that he's got a bunch of these 5-gallon water jugs that he bought from Bay Hay, I automatically think Toby's cool, and I go the next day and I'm motivated. Oh, well, there's my social proof. Toby has done it. So that's where we start, but it takes a lot of work, a lot of different ideas to just get that conversation started.
And I think your point about the rich-poor difference and the gap, that's a real one, and it's a real factor, even here in the island. When a crisis like this hits, money doesn't matter as much. It does matter if you've got the right kind of stuff on hand to protect you, and maybe it means barricading you in, but that's not going to necessarily work for the long term. So I think the challenge is to find the common ground. What's the common ground? And then develop your clarity around that and keep repeating that clarity overly and over again. And I'm from Silicon Valley. I still spend a lot of my psychic energy there. We've got a lot of really rich tech people that are planning for the apocalypse by escaping on their own and protecting themselves. That may or may not work, but it's not a good solution.
It will work for the individual. It will not work for society.
Not at all.
And so what we're doing is flipping that on its head and saying,
exactly,
we want to create the societal solution, the community-minded solution.
Exactly.
And we are a great community to do it because of that absurdly high volunteer rate that we've got on this island. It's like 70% plus. That's bonkers. If you compare that to the rest of the country, I think the rate is 17% on average.
So here's another kind of interesting perspective that's in the Office Shock book, because we've been studying here what's the future of distributed work and working from home, where it's not the office the way it's been as usual. And during the COVID shutdown, there was really interesting research done by the Blue Zones Project that showed that the happiest people are purpose-driven. They have a sense of meaning. They're happier, they're healthier, they live up to 7 years longer. Purpose-driven people who work for purpose-driven organizations are happier, they're healthier, they live up to 14 years longer, and the companies perform better, or the organizations perform better. So we know that purpose and meaning are critical. Joining something like Bainbridge Prepares is a source of meaning. This is also really true of the kids. We were having a conversation going in about how to reach the kids and what the kids can provide. The kids, like all of us at some level, the kids are particularly interested in meaning too. What's the meaning? What's the purpose? And I'm really a big believer in not only mentoring young people, but having them mentor us, what I call reverse mentoring. So you've spent a lot of your time trying to get kids involved in your program too, in Bainbridge Prepares.
Well, we've got an entire team dedicated to child safety. It's run by Kari Murphy, one of our longtime volunteers, who is also of Girl Scout fame. She basically runs Girl Scouts for this half of the state. And she's written curriculum specific to kids, specific to the Girl Scouts. And that curriculum gets them a little zombie badge, but it's a happy zombie. It's not a scary zombie. And what I learned from Kari is that I would rather have a whole troop of Girl Scouts at an emergency than necessarily the equivalent number of adults, because these kids are really highly trained,
Right.
highly motivated,
Right.
positive thinking, and they know what they're doing.
Exactly, and they're digital natives. So,
Yes.
and when we think about young people, what we say is there's two important thresholds. One was 2010. The iPhone was introduced in 2007. The iPad shortly thereafter. So 2010 was one big threshold. So if we know from psychology, and I'm a sociologist by training, we know from sociology and psychology that whatever media environment you have around you when you're between the age 13 and 15 will shape the rest of your life. So we know those kids that were 13 to 15 in 2010, well, those kids are now 28 or younger. Those are the first true digital natives. It's not the millennials, they're too old. These young people first started to become adults as the iPhone and the iPad had. 2020 is the second threshold. That's when the beginning of virtual reality, augmented reality, blended reality, and homeschooling, all those hit in 2020. So if you were between 13 and 15, you're different. You're really different. And you're what we call a cross reality, an XR, or a blended reality native. Recruit those young people, because those young people are growing up with digital media skills that we can't imagine. You know, I was lucky when I was a PhD student at Northwestern, I got introduced to the internet. It was called the ARPANET. I had an internet identity in 1972, really early, but I'm not a digital native because it happened too late. I was already in my 20s. So these young people, I think, are so powerful. Other questions, please. Yes, thank you. Here comes Tyler.
Thank you. Scott, I had a question for you about your use of Starlink and also the ham radio opportunities. I think at Barn there was some thought about ham radio, and I don't know if that's progressed, but can individuals easily get the Starlink, and how much does it cost? Because I've heard about it used so often in Ukraine, but never thought of it for here. Thank you.
So first for ham radio, if you go to our website, click on Teams up at the top, and you'll see ham radio communication as one of the teams. That team regularly hosts trainings. It's actually pretty darn simple to get your ham radio license. We've got an entire group of folks that will support you in that effort. And the equipment is dirt cheap. Like, there's a great ham radio for $25 that you can get. That team would love to have you. And frankly, the more ham radio qualified folks we have spread across the neighborhood, the better it is. Because again, what our experiment is doing is about mutual aid. It's about neighbors taking care of neighbors so that it frees up the first responders so they can do their job. Because the math doesn't work otherwise. There's half a dozen responders on the island at any given time. There's 25,000 of us, normal citizens. So we need to flip that math upside down to make it work. And ham radio is a great force multiplier for that, for being able to communicate. For Starlink, Starlink is relatively new. Yes, you did see it. They dropped tons of them over in the Ukraine to help with communications. Their first round was appealing to folks who lived rural and couldn't get normal fast internet connection, broadband. If you're in one of the pockets on this island where you are like me and you're just a quarter of a mile away from broadband, it's a great solution. If you go to starlink.com, that's where you'll find all the information. It's very simple to do. It's still pretty spendy. The way Susan and I looked at it was we just decided, what are we going to remove from our budget in order to be able to afford fast internet for the first time in our lives?
What did you remove?
I don't want to say. It has to do with an addiction to coffee, which I no longer have.
I see.
Now I've got several cafe owners around here not happy with me, so I don't show up every day. Other questions? One back here and then up here.
Hi, my name is Marion, and I have a question for Bob. Bob, I just finished the book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends by Nicole Perlroth, which
Yeah.
deals with cybersecurity.
Right,
My
right.
question is, what do you think of cybersecurity and the safety of our financial institutions, and what future safeguards do you see coming that will protect our monetary resources?
I'm
Yeah.
so glad you get this question.
That's a really scary book, and I think it's a good one. I'm not an expert in that, but I have colleagues who are, and I hang around a number of people who are. It's very troubling. The more digital we become, in a sense, the more vulnerable we become. And the methods of protecting ourselves are not obvious. So my military friends are very concerned about cyber warfare, where the motivation is not particular, it's general, basically to create a sense of chaos and disorder. And that's a lot easier than a specific attack. So I'm troubled by that, and I just don't have an easy answer to that. I think that book's a good start in terms of understanding the problem, but I don't know a single source book that's good at saying, well, how do we engage in that problem? You know, particularly since we've got a political environment now that's so polarized and so polarizing.
I have a junior at college who is a cybersecurity geek. He's a math major and a linguistics minor, and that is his life. Is he understands the math behind
Nice.
Cryptography.
Good career opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, the kid's got future. He'll cringe if he's never going to watch this anyway. But do the basics first. Have a set of passwords that are actual real passwords, that are not, easy to guess ones, that have something to do with your life. Have a password manager that's a separate program that you know the password to that one, and then it holds all your other passwords to all the other websites, because those should not all be the same password. Don't do what I did 10, 15 years ago, and as you said, need to start making passwords, you just use the same password over and over and over. That's asking for a world of hurt. Instead, just real strong password on that password manager, and then in fact, if you use a browser often, if you're creating a new account, it will default to prompt you, can I use a strong password? And it's a long string of gobbledygook. Let it. And just have that recorded in your password manager, where you have that one password that you need to memorize. The second thing would be tell somebody, or rather two people that you trust, what that password is, and that you use a password manager. In the case of getting hit by the number 10 bus, you don't want to have all the family finances on your laptop under a lock and key that only you know what the password is. Everybody else around you will be very frustrated with you at your funeral. So. There was another question up here. Yes, sir. Right in the middle, puff jacket.
I'd like more investigation into the relationship of mankind with nature. You spoke of identifying with nature, empathetic with nature, but what is the breadth and the depth of what you're talking about?
It's a really varied concept. So it can be very personal and very practical about your lifestyle, sort of living with and close to nature. It's also, if you do big picture forecasting, the link between biology, nature, and computing is beginning to grow closer and closer. So in Silicon Valley, we like to think, most of us would like to think, that the future of computing is linked very closely to biology. So essentially my bioempathy is going to apply to technology too. So it's not either mechanical or biological. Increasingly now it's going to be a blend. of biology and computing, biology and digital. We're moving from a world, when I started with tech, and again, I'm a humble social scientist, so I'm not a tech guy, but I grew up with tech. But in the beginning, there was this traditional shift, kind of a trend, from analog, which is basically waves, to digital, which is basically zeros and ones. And that was a big shift into the digital world. Now, interestingly, we're moving in the direction toward quantum. We're moving back again in a certain way, but it's not backwards. It's more as a kind of cycling or a spinning out. And the spinning out is really a hybrid of the waves of analog and the digital. So the future of digital is things like big data visualization, big data analytics, gameful engagement, machine learning, generative AI. Those sorts of things are much more biological, much more flow-oriented, much more wave-oriented, and not as starkly zeros and ones as was the case when I started my career roughly 50 years ago. So I think you're going to see now that notion of bioempathy, or thinking in terms of cycles, not lines, thinking in terms of flow states and waves, not just zeros and ones. So that's what I mean by full spectrum thinking. It's thinking about the future across gradients of possibility instead of categorizing in narrow ways, particularly binary ways. And in a way, the whole notion of digital computing, zeros and ones, it's the ultimate categorization. When you've got to get it down to a 0 or a 1, that's the ultimate. We're moving in a different direction, but I think part of that different direction is capturing the beauty of nature and thinking of things more as flows and less of machines.
Much of the work that we've done on community preparedness is also based off of love of nature. In fact, this book that I wrote is, in essence, a Trojan horse for getting folks to talk about the climate crisis, who normally, if I said eco anything or green anything, your eyes would glaze over. I talked, just for gross generalization, I talked with enough audiences in red states that I would get the glazed over or hostile intent when I would talk about sustainability. It made me start thinking, how can I get the message into these people's heads? And preparedness, you know what? Red state folks will listen to you talk about preparedness all day long. And I can get them to the same point of harvesting rainwater off of their roof and other environmental practices and group resilience practices through a lens of preparedness rather than sustainability, because they won't listen to this one, but they will to this one. So there's a lot of, in true love-focused, community preparedness work, there's a whole lot of that is based off of nature and the love of nature.
So we're just about at a break. We got two. Can we get two relatively quick, profoundly positive questions?
AMK first.
Yeah, this has been a really fascinating discussion, but I need a little clarity before
Sure.
the break.
Nice, okay.
You talked about trend versus disruption,
Yes,
and then you used earthquake as an example of both.
of both.
So I would really appreciate hearing how you would think of the pandemic.
Sure. So the pandemic was a little of both. It was actually quite predictable. We had very much like what happened in our forecast beginning in 2009, and Bill Gates had a very specific forecast and a TED Talk in 2015. So it really wasn't a complete disruption as a trend. It was more of a trend. It was inevitable that something was going to happen at the intersection of human health, animal health, and environment. It was pretty clear that was the trend. But then when COVID actually hit, that was a disruption, and that was unpredictable. And then the second and third and fourth order effects, those were disruptions. Now, another example would be demography. Demography is clearly a trend. You can actually do macro level forecasting about aging societies, for example. And those really are clear, and not only clear, but they're certain at some level, at a macro level. The kids that I talked about, the digital natives and the XR natives, they're a disruption. you really can't predict what they're going to do and extrapolate from us. You can't extrapolate to the kids. Please, you get the last question. Wow. Yeah.
Lots of pressure. Thank you. Really enjoying this. I especially what Scott was saying a couple of minutes ago about the effectiveness of the connecting with the red states and restating the message so that it was meaningful to them. And I'm wondering if there's anything else about connecting with the other 90% of people that are just doing day-to-day survival. You know, they're living paycheck to paycheck,
Yeah.
and they're worried about their basic needs and don't have the time
Yes.
to get prepared and connect with
Yes.
their community. Any insights or suggestions you have would be appreciated.
So
wanna
maybe
go
we
first?
can use this as a close.
Yeah.
You can do a closing out, please.
So that's something, as we've helped other towns start, that is a very real issue, is you get a whole set of go bags, they go to individuals' homes, those individuals are low income enough that they crack that backpack open because they need the food in it 2 weeks later when the paycheck hasn't come in and their kids are hungry. So those are very real concerns. It's an issue that can be solved a few different ways. The way we've tried to approach it is to say, here's your target goal. Let's say that it's 4 weeks worth of food to save up. One family can buy that in one evening on the internet or the next day at a store like Wildernest or Bay and Feed that has freeze-dried food. Most families can't do that. Most families need to have a long-term play over that. So we developed 12-month-long calendars. Here's how, if you start with little incremental changes today, similar to that IRA example that I had at the beginning, small incremental changes a year from now make a big difference. 3 years from now make a big difference. And they're doing so, they're making those small behavioral changes in a way where if they do need to pull from those foodstuffs for the kids 3 weeks later or 3 months later, that is okay. And they are told explicitly, that is okay. This is your food for emergencies. And you can define an emergency as an earthquake. You can define an emergency as you got laid off and you don't have money for food that week for the kids. And so when those people are given that permission, something changes in their head. They start thinking about putting away foodstuffs. Again, this is just as an example. They start thinking about it differently, and there's a different value to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I like his answer better than mine. What I'm going to give is a kind of higher level futurist and story and close with that. What the higher level futurist story is, we live in a polarized moment and we live in a polarizing world, and the kind of red state, blue state thing is just one example of it. The big lesson from foresight and from strategic futures is, if you can leap ahead and think future back, and when you go out to the future, look for common ground, look for the commons. What is it that you share? So even if it's a polarized political conversation, you try to go far enough out to say, what are the values you share? What are the things you share? And then you work backwards from those things that you have in common. We did a forecast some years back on the future of food security, and it was for an organization in Europe. And we were thinking of it as a 10-year forecast. And we got completely stuck because the conversation was polarized around GMO foods. There was very smart, very well-intentioned people that believed that GMO foods was a yes or no choice. It's really not. It's a spectrum of choices. You know, some around food chemistry, some of which are good and some of which are bad. By going 30 years out, we depolarized the conversation. And everybody could agree that if you wanted to talk about global hunger and global food security, you had to talk about food chemistry. So the clue from the foresight work is you got to find that common ground in the conversation, whether it's one-on-one or whether it's with a big organization. And the thought I'd like to leave you with is, even in this frightening VUCA world, even with all these challenges, if we can be clear about our direction, if we can have clarity and have that conversation and bond around the clarity, as you're doing with Bainbridge Prepares, if we can bond around the clarity and avoid the certainty. You know, the certainty is going to be popular in the short run. We see it in the election cycle, politicians who are certain but not clear. That's very dangerous in the long run. And I'm convinced, having done this for 50 years now, that the future will reward clarity. It'll reward clarity, but it will punish. It'll punish certainty in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.